Welcome back to another episode of Light Beer, Dark Money. I'm Sean Noble. Chris is out. We are on location, a special location, right down in at the Hermosa Inn. And our special guest today is Caroline Downey from National Review. And Caroline,
great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
This is kind of, so we typically do this in the studio, so our audience will, if you're watching, definitely say, well, that's a totally different look. So
yeah,
it's kind of fun to do.
Love the Southwestern venue.
Yeah. we want to bring hospitality. So Caroline, anyone who is a subscriber to National Review has read your work, seen your stuff online. But for those who haven't, give us a sense of the types of stuff you cover and how did you end up here at National Review?
Well, I am in the trenches of the culture war, which when I started at National Review 4 years ago, I would say it was a less treaded area as a journalistic beat for National Review, because obviously our bread and butter, our expertise has often been, first of all, a broad overview of what conservative philosophy is and how it applies to national political issues. Economics, essential. We have incredible scholars on the regulatory state, on trade, on just general free market principles, and, also electoral politics. I feel like National Review is a reliable place to go to for that. But culture war, and what I mean by that critical race theory, that was budding in 2020, right after the pandemic and amid the 2020 election fallout. There was also these parental movements, parental rights activism, that it was like this groundswell of parental engagement at a local level, but across the country on these issues, basically these Marxist frameworks that were infiltrating K through 12 school systems everywhere, not just critical race theory, but gender ideology, both very noxious ideas that are both, in my opinion, fundamentally Marxist, because they're essentially trying to abolish the family and to turn neighbor against neighbor. Critical race theory being this race baiting idea that, your neighbors and anyone around you, you would have this new suspicion for them because on the basis of race, right? Like you you carry this intrinsic evilness because of the color of your skin, and that America is complicit basically in white supremacy and all these terrible things. And on the other hand, gender ideology is this idea that gender is a spectrum, and that children as young as 4, 5, 6 years old can be told they're born in the wrong body, and then that gets introduced into these curricula in schools, and it leads kids down this dangerous rabbit hole of basically invasive medicalization that is often permanent. There's very little escape from that. So those were the two kind of enemies I was noticing as I began culture war reporting. And then that kind of moved into certain offshoots. So I covered the detransitioners, those who regretted those gender surgeries and hormones and what they felt the medical industry that had been ideologically captured, what it had done to them, and then, their lawsuits. And then I also covered kind of transgender identifying men's intrusion into traditionally female spaces, whether that's sororities. I covered this very big case in the University of Wyoming, which is, you never think Wyoming would fall victim to this, but there was a very prominent case that gained national recognition. National Review was on top of it. I was on top of it, Megyn Kelly. And that became another big lawsuit where it was like, okay, does a sisterhood, a sorority, this is the institution of Greek life. It is sex segregated by definition. Are these girls who are members entitled to have a space that is separate from, or rather free from men who are claiming to be women? And then, of course, there's prisons as well as sports. Sports, I think, has probably been the most salient just because there are so many families out there with young girls who have hopes of, obtaining athletic scholarships, rather. We're seeing this at the international level with the Olympics, and how all these governing bodies are basically passing the buck to kind of their their subsidiary organizations, rather than they're being cowardly about
Right.
taking a stand on this issue, and they're either copping out by saying we'll institute a testosterone requirement so that we can somehow mitigate the kind of aggression or the physical advantages that male competitors have in female divisions, or we'll just kind of not rule on the issue altogether. And so there's been a lack of courage from what I would say just all the adults in the room on the culture war issue predominantly. I'd say there's kind of a weakness and a lack of bravery from adults, as I would say, like, predominantly young women are getting their rights eroded.
Right. It's interesting because, I think about this. I've got to believe that particularly lesbians of the LGBTQ crowd are going to be the ones who kind of lead the backlash to the trans issue, won't they? I mean, I know that they're trying to be inclusive, and I think that that's where some of the fear of the adults comes from, is they don't want to be look like they're homophobic. But the trans issue is totally different,
right?
In the sense that women have fought for equality, for rights, for, and so they finally get to a point where it's probably better to be a woman now than at any point in history.
Yeah,
you're a woman. I'm just assuming. And then the guy says, "Oh no, I'm a woman now.
Yeah,
so forget it."
Yeah, no, there's many members of the gay community that have kind of brought about this civil war within LGBT, the movement, because to your point, they're saying they don't represent us. The T part does not represent us, and there's a number of organizations that come to mind that are, I mean, even, of course, they're sort of derogatorily nicknamed TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, J.K. Rowlings of the world.
Right.
There's quite a few of these old school liberal feminists who are saying, okay, you're basically, by advocating for trans activism so aggressively, this is meaning not only erasure of women, but erasure of gay people. And here's why. Many of the detransitioners I've interviewed, quite a few, pretty much all of them told me that they were, struggling with sexuality, and instead of just kind of choosing that path, they were basically led down the trans route. And especially with men, many transgender identifying men who are actually biological men, chances are they're really just gay.
Yeah,
they're just for whatever reason they couldn't feel like they could be that or something. Or, I mean, most of these, especially the young adults, they experience abuse as children, and that is extremely disorienting for them, whether they were, preyed upon by family members or, online. I mean, I have a lot of documented tales of what they experienced that was so jarring for them, that they had an identity crisis and they were so uncomfortable in their skin, in their bodies. I mean, even with women, if a woman experiences like unwanted, inappropriate male attention at a very young age, a number of these detransitioners I talked to said that, that was so horrifying that basically they just wanted to not be a woman anymore, because they wanted to kind of divorce themselves from that trauma. And so the way to do that, the way to make sure that they would never be, a target, was to become a man. And then there are the kids on the autism spectrum. I was saying this earlier, puberty is a very uncomfortable experience for all adolescents.
Right.
But if you're on the autism spectrum, it can be sometimes excruciating. I mean, I know because my brother is on the autism spectrum, and you don't like the bodily changes that are happening. You are sensitive to a lot of different things, and so when you're an autistic kid, and maybe you're online, maybe you're on Tumblr, and you're reading about this gender craze, this is an out for you, right? If puberty is something that is very, very uncomfortable. So unfortunately, gender ideology has preyed on so many and so many different categories of person, but it's usually those who just need nurturing. They just need an adult to tell them, like, you will get through this, very awkward phase. You like, just affirming their natural body rather than leading them down this disastrous path that they will likely regret.
Yeah. Well, and there is, I kind of came across a couple years ago a story of a girl who had become a boy and detransitioned back to a girl. It was a heartbreaking thing to read. Especially, what was amazing is how much vitriol and hate she got from other trans.
Yeah, where did you read that?
People. It was a Twitter thread,
Mm.
and I can't remember her name. I'm sure you might have even interviewed her, because she's developed quite a following. But for me, as a middle-aged guy, who both had a sister who struggled when she was a child. I mean, when she was 4 or 5 years old, if you asked her, what do you want to be when you grow up? I'm going to be a boy.
Mm-hmm.
And it took her many
Tomboys.
years. Yeah. I mean, she was very much a tomboy, and she eventually realized and came out as lesbian, and she was never more comfortable than when she finally accepted that, which is fine. But she did struggle. And so I can't imagine if she'd been if she had been that age now, with parents who were afraid to get in the way.
Well, because they're given basically a moral ultimatum, usually in the doctor's office, and I was talking about ideologically captured medicine earlier, but these gender clinics, usually the refrain that they'll give parents that are struggling with a gender-confused child is this verbatim line: would you rather have a trans kid or a dead daughter? So that's the moral blackmail that they think is appropriate to give parents that are just trying to navigate this difficulty. What they want to hear from doctors is not, yes, let's put them under the knife. Yes, let's treat this so-called diagnoses of gender dysphoria. What they want to hear is that this is a phase, and with proper counseling and with, good at-home environments, and maybe honestly removing them from the school system altogether and homeschooling them, maybe taking them away from those toxic influences. I'm sure we've heard so many cases of rogue teachers basically socially transitioning their students without the parents' consent. Then the kids come home and the parents don't recognize the kid, and they had no idea what went on during the school day. So, I mean, talk about, parental rights.
Yeah.
Like, parents have, in many cases, lost ownership over their kids.
Well, and there's just no question that there is a social contagion component. I mean, Abigail Schreier's written about this, and you've covered it. So where does this go? If you're looking 10 years into the future, what are you seeing? Because I look at the 10 years in the future, and it is so cloudy for me, because I'm not in it like you are.
I'm seeing an army of victims that are just now coming into their power and realizing the harm that was done to them. And I think they're going to come back with a vengeance. And I think there's going to be a legal reckoning that is unleashed upon all the institutions that have advanced this very, very toxic, this scandal that, and I think flash forward 50 years, maybe even less, we're going to look back at this time and say, this was the equivalent of like lobotomies.
Yeah.
Like, this was the equivalent of other really controversial medical experimentation that now we're ashamed is on our national record. I mean, but again, this all has a facade of like, this is humanitarian because this is being accepting and inclusive, when in reality we are ruining lives. And because nobody, and I have to wonder, what are the incentives? I think money is a big incentive, especially in the medical industry, because there is so much. I mean, these surgeries are profitable, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. So that's very scary. But also, I think there are people out there who genuinely believe that it is better to administer so-called gender-affirming care rather than because they're, I mean, suicidality is always what is threatened, right? Like these kids, they say, okay, well, if we don't give them this treatment and kind of affirm their delusion, then they will kill themselves. But, you know, there was actually a Finnish study that came out a couple months ago, or maybe it was like 6 months ago. And basically what it found was that most transgender identifying kids, you know, like the suicidality is much more rare. Suicide is much more rare than they are claiming it to be, first of all. And second of all, when you examine, you know, their kind of mental condition more closely, there are psychological comorbidities in most of these cases.
Interesting. Meaning
that these people, these kids already struggle with psychological issues. It's not that, because what the trans lobbyists and activists will claim is that their gender dysphoria creates secondary problems, or, you know, the reason why they struggle with mental health is because they're bullied, because they're not accepted for who they are, because their peers will kind of you know, punish them, or they will you know, make them feel alien. But in reality, it's the other way around, that the mental health issues are pre-existing, and instead of treating those first, they put a Band-Aid on it and say, well, actually, your bipolar disorder or your ADHD or whatever issue it might be, you know, borderline, is gender dysphoria, and you need to become the opposite sex, you know, surgically to heal you. So, like, that's the twisted nature of medicine right now, where it's been hijacked by the left, is like they're inventing a new scientific method almost. Yeah. So,
well, and how is it that I you know, as an American, I complain about Europe a lot, and you know how far off the reservation they are on a lot of things. How is it that they are so much better?
I know.
On this issue, with preventing kids from being mutilated? So
this is what I've learned, and it is a somewhat of an indictment, I guess, of our privatized healthcare system. Although obviously, I will choose our healthcare system over Europe's, and specifically Canada or the UK, any day of the week, because it's actually, you know, the most competitive. There's not, you know, month-long wait lists to get treatment, or, you know, cancer, chemotherapy, whatever it is. That being said, I think because of nationalized healthcare in Europe, they've removed the profit incentive from gender medicine, or partially at least.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So in the US, you can still prescribe hormones, prescribe testosterone. Let's get those injections. You know, and actually, you know, you're sitting down for a diagnosis. We don't actually really need to consult with you much longer. We've actually already decided after one visit that you are in fact trans, and you need to treat it immediately. There will be no waiting period. There'll be no deliberation. There'll be no due diligence or discernment. Let's just expedite you down this path, and then you're going to be a patient for life. That's the problem. Yeah. And it's tough, because I'm like, okay, as a free marketeer, you know, what do you do in that case, right? Like, because, and that's my guess, is that the UK specifically, which has rolled back some of this trans activism, especially by, you know, shutting down that one clinic after the Cass report basically found, you know, that what was happening with minors, you know, that's a positive development. I wish that was happening as much here, you know, in America. If not for investigative journalists like, you know, with Matt Walsh, you know, in Nashville with the Vanderbilt Clinic, and I mean, Texas Children's Hospital is a case that I covered in Houston. They, you know, were basically operating a covert child sex change operation after they had pledged that they wouldn't, after, you know, the Attorney General Ken Paxton basically deemed these surgeries and therapies child abuse. And so the hospital pledged that they would stop the program, and then they actually didn't. They went behind basically the public's back and continued them, you know, like that. And that requires exposing, and I did expose it, and I actually ended up on a blacklist for Texas Children's Hospital, so I no longer I cannot show up on the premises. A couple other journalist friends of mine can't either. But, you know, that's what you have to do here, whereas the UK has just kind of naturally realize that this has gone too far. And yeah, I'd say money. It tends to be a big reason why.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like almost all things, follow the money.
Yeah.
Now, stepping back a little bit, did just to so because I mean you kind of know this, but I am a huge fan of National Review. I've been reading it, since I was a child. My first introduction to William F. Buckley. So this goes back a long time before you were born. I think you're not even 30 yet, right?
No. Yeah. Right.
So this is 30 years ago, literally. I was doing John Shattuck's campaign for Congress, and obviously, his family is close to the Goldwater, and William F. Buckley was getting the Goldwater Award at the Goldwater Institute. This was in the summer of 1994, maybe it was spring of 1994, and so we were going to we had a fundraiser that had Senator Goldwater and William F. Buckley, which was just amazing. And then I was able to be the person who went and picked up William F. Buckley at the airport.
So cool.
And
love that.
I had read him, for years. I was just a huge fanboy. I was so deep into it. You had mentioned earlier at this breakfast that you listened to Rush Limbaugh. I was a disciple of Rush Limbaugh.
Yes.
Every day. And I couldn't have been more excited. And he walks off the plane. This is before, I could meet him at the gate. This is before, obviously, 9/11. And it was the most jarring moment of my life because he was so disheveled. One pant leg is up over his knee, and he's got this bag, and it was just like, it was it was a long flight, wow. and I get it and now that I kind of like step back, I just had such a you idolize someone, and then you see the person who is human. And, he'd had a terrible flight. It was long and he was tired and, he'd been working and it was that moment. And then we got in the car and we had just a wonderful conversation. I realized, not every person looks perfect every time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, also, I think that there's a National Review. There's so many brilliant minds, and a lot of them have this kind of scrappy scholar thing going on, where their minds are going a mile a minute. They are voracious readers. I mean, I remember walking into the headquarters for the first time at National Review in New York, and just seeing piles and piles of books kind of strewn about at everyone's desk. I mean, these are the real deal. I think maybe in an ideal world, some of them they'd love to be in a cozy mahogany bound room with a leather bound chair and a nice typewriter. And, sometimes that means they're like a little bit like disheveled because.
Well, I can only imagine, Richard Brookheiser had to been he was the original cultural reporter, right? Or columnist. But he strikes me as one of those very kind of buttoned down, sophisticated, type of thing.
Well, I mean, their priority isn't always being super polished, right? Because they're focused on the life of the mind and kind of.
Well, and I one thing that I was thinking about as I was getting prepared for this podcast was National Review has been such a critical institution from the very beginning. 1955, Buckley writes, "Standing athwart." We're standing athwart history, yelling stop. If there isn't anything that's more relevant today, I mean, it's amazing to me how timeless that perspective is. I mean, he's got to just be rolling in his grave when he sees what the world looks like right now in comparison to what it did in 1955, what it did in 2008 when he passed away. Also had a chance to attend his funeral.
Oh, wow. Incredible.
But it's been such an important institution for anyone who is not a subscriber to National Review. You have to subscribe. If you don't give to the National Review Institute, you need to do that, because it is the most important. I believe it's the most important journal of conservatism
Totally.
without question.
Totally. That's what I.
Because it is the one that's lasted,
Yeah.
and it's the one that's been the most consistent about the
Yes.
conservative
Yes.
thought.
It's enduring and yet extremely consistent and like steadfast in its adherence to timeless truths. And I was telling the students at Grand Canyon University last night that it's kind of like it's the flagship magazine of mainstream conservatism, which Buckley popularized. So that's an incredible feat
Right.
altogether, and this is an extension of his legacy. It is his legacy. And like, even if I was telling, because they were asking me how do they get started reading political journals if they're not really junkies for that. And I said, well, National Review, it's very advanced. Like, there's no doubt that you will find the most sophisticated arguments on a whole suite of policy issues on that website and in the physical print copy, which is beautiful. It was just redone, and now it's thicker, and I love the way it was revamped. But I still think they should read it because, I mean, I read it as a high schooler, and it was right over my head, a lot of it, but it was like aspirational, and it kind of planted a seed of curiosity to want more and to want to have as great and thorough, comprehensive of understanding as possible on these very tricky issues. And I mean, it's just an incredible command of the English language. Like, I mean, National Review, I knew how to write when I got there, but they actually taught me how to write once I got there. And that is an art that is lost today as well, especially among younger generations. Good writing and persuasiveness, I feel like it's kind of a dying art. So
when I think about National Review, I mean, I've had the opportunity to visit the many years ago, and you're exactly right. It's chaos, wonderful chaos.
Yes.
I feel like there's not only the conservative thought, that goes from 55 forward, but one of the things that Buckley fought against, and this is very applicable to me personally, and I'll explain that, is that Buckley fought against the John Birch Society. He didn't want the radicalization of the conservative movement. And so, he worked hard to push them out. And I feel like, we're kind of in that situation with this ultra populist, call it MAGA, whatever, part of the conservative movement. And, when I was growing up, my mom was very much a John Birch Society advocate.
Oh, yeah.
She had a subscription to the New American.
Oh, really?
And my dad was definitely more of the just straight line conservative, and he had the subscription to National Review. Now, back then, National Review was a biweekly. And so for every 2 National Reviews, there'd be 1 New American. So I was getting more influence from National Review, which made me more mainstream in the conservative thought.
It was a balance in your household.
Exactly. But it strikes, I used to tell that story and think, oh, isn't that interesting that we had to do that? We had to go through that exercise. We had to purge kind of the radicalism to keep on pace. And yet here we are again, history repeating itself. And I think that only makes the National Review that much more important for people who care about freedom, who care about the country, and care about the future of conservatism.
Yes, because those principles are mostly unchanging. And I mean, I just think about on the pro-life issue alone, National Review has been unwavering. And I see now it's like a very troubling development, but the kind of new fringes of the right are realizing that this is the issue is a political liability, and so I think there's like this temptation for them to abandon ship altogether. I mean, I hear a lot of rhetoric on the right that's like basically to the effect of Roe should have never been overturned because it unleashed this whatever like kind of dormant energy that basically things were settled even though it was bad law, and in my opinion was a blot on our jurisprudence, and the precedent was, in my opinion, like was untenable. It shouldn't have stayed just as a matter of principle. But they argue that now there's this frenzy in the country for the abortion issue, and that could undermine Republicans' chances of getting elected because for whatever reason all these red states have passed referenda to effectively codify abortion into the state constitutions as some sort of reaction. And so it's very sad to see that kind of parroting of the left,
Right.
and even like adopting some of their statist principles. I mean, I hear it all the time from what I thought were free market people, and on the trade issue, I understand that it's complicated with China, and but like the trade war does more harm than good, and we see that across the country in just in consumer costs, right? So we've probably lost the plot, I think, on a number of those issues. But yeah, National Review, just having those timeless truth, and like I was saying earlier, I do think that once you're in office, I think the real intellectually grounded conservatives, my guess is they could win out, because I mean, just the last Trump administration, I don't think anybody, I didn't feel like it was a particularly populist administration.
Right.
The tax cuts, okay, that's a pretty
standard.
That's a pretty Reagan-esque,
right,
policy. And now, we're right now, as we're a few weeks out from the election, we're litigating, Kamala Harris's tax policies and Donald Trump's tax policies. That's pretty standard too.
Right.
So I would think that, if he were elected, that there would be some collaboration with kind of the more classical liberals.
Yeah. There's no question that his presidency was less populist and disruptive than anyone ever thought it would be. And it was more classically conservative than anyone thought it would be.
Yes, but you're right that the rhetoric on the campaign trail, it tends to be different, I think. And so...
And I think that, I mean, what I think we have to do as traditional conservatives is those populists who are now identifying as conservatives, even though they may not really be, we can now have an opportunity to teach them. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. You like this? Well, guess what? This gets even better when you put some rationality into it.
Yeah. Yeah. And because you don't want to be proposing things that mimic the left that end up backfiring, because then like, how do we distinguish ourselves from the left at that point?
Right.
I mean, then it's really a uniparty after all. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely caution that is needed in their direction. And I still know that even those kind of new fringes, I know that they still read National Review, right? Because there's just no better place for robust, policy explanations than National Review. There really isn't. So on economics, on, like constitutional matters, on Second Amendment matters, like there's just no better place. So, I think they secretly they still read it. They still consult it.
Yeah.
I believe that. So, yeah.
Good. Caroline, where can people follow you, reach you, that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, follow my work at National Review, and my Twitter is a great place to see kind of the latest scoops I'm doing with investigative reporting. And then also National Review has a YouTube channel where I do kind of bi-weekly videos on basically what trending political topics, but also pop culture. And they're bite-sized, more like 10-minute videos. But yeah, it's a different medium for NR, and more casual and fun. But it's a great way of complementing our written word in the magazine. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
Go to nationalreview.com and definitely subscribe if you don't. Go contribute to National Review Institute and follow Caroline Downey.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.